Everyone went quiet when my father slapped me across the face. My cheek burned, but the way he looked at me hurt even more. He had demanded I give my house to my sister, and when I finally said no, he completely lost it. I couldn't believe he'd hit me in front of the whole family just because I stood up for myself. I felt totally alone until my sister's fiancé grabbed the mic and stepped between us. I thought he was going to stop the fight, but he was actually holding a secret that would ruin everything. Michael drove his car into the crowded driveway and parked near the front entrance of the home. The gravel crunched loudly beneath his tires as he pulled into the long path. Cars lined every available space on the lawn, making it clear most of the family had already arrived. He maneuvered his sedan carefully until he found a spot right near the front porch. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly for a moment before he turned off the engine. He walked into the living room where his father Robert was holding a large family meeting. The murmur of voices stopped almost instantly as he entered the hallway. He made his way directly to the spacious living room where everyone had gathered. In the center stood his father Robert, looking impatient and stern. The family sat on couches and folding chairs, their eyes shifting nervously between the two men. It felt more like a courtroom than a family home. Robert pointed at the legal documents on the table and tried to hand Michael a pen. He wasted no time with pleasantries or greetings. He gestured sharply toward a stack of legal documents resting on the coffee table. Without saying a word, he picked up a pen and thrust it toward Michael's chest. The implication was clear to everyone watching in the silence. He expected Michael to sign over the deed to the house immediately. Michael pushed the papers away across the table and shook his head at his father. He looked down at the crisp white pages that would strip him of his property. He firmly placed his hand on the stack and slid the papers across the table, away from him. He looked directly into Robert's eyes and shook his head slowly. The refusal hung heavy in the air, shocking the relatives who never saw anyone defy Robert. Robert slammed his hand down on the surface and shouted for everyone in the room to hear. The rejection caused Robert to snap instantly. He slammed his open palm onto the wooden table with a deafening crack. Vases rattled on the shelves as he began to shout at the top of his lungs. He listed Michael's supposed failures and called him selfish for not helping his sister. Every guest in the room flinched at the outburst but remained seated. Sarah stood in the corner of the room and watched the argument unfold without interfering at all. She leaned against the wall with her arms crossed, simply watching the scene play out. Despite being the person who would benefit from the signature, she said nothing to defend her brother. Her eyes darted between her father and Michael, but her expression remained unreadable. She seemed content to let Robert fight this battle for her while she stayed safe on the sidelines. Robert stepped closer to Michael and grabbed the collar of his son's blue dress shirt tight. Robert decided that yelling was not achieving the desired result. He marched around the coffee table and invaded Michael's personal space aggressively. Before Michael could react, Robert reached out and grabbed a handful of his son's blue dress shirt. He twisted the collar tight, pulling Michael forward until their faces were inches apart. The fabric strained against the force of his grip. Michael pulled away from the grip, but Robert raised his hand high in the air. Michael reacted instinctively and jerked his body back to break the hold. The sudden movement caused Robert to lose his grip on the shirt collar. However, the separation only seemed to enrage the older man further. Robert raised his hand high above his head, ready to strike. Michael braced himself, but he did not think his father would actually go through with it. The entire room went silent as Robert struck Michael across the face with significant force. A sharp crack echoed through the living room, silencing every whisper. Robert's hand connected with Michael's cheek with shocking force. The impact snapped Michael's head to the side. Nobody moved or spoke as the reality of the assault settled in. Even Robert seemed momentarily frozen by his own action, his hand still hovering in the air. The physical line had been crossed. Michael stumbled back against the wall while holding his cheek as the guests gasped in shock. He lost his balance from the blow and stumbled backward. He caught himself against the living room wall, his hand immediately flying to his stinging face. Several aunts and cousins covered their mouths and gasped audibly. The red mark on Michael's skin was already beginning to show. He stared at his father with a mix of pain and disbelief. Jason walked through the crowd and stood firmly between Michael and his angry father Robert. Movement broke the paralysis near the back of the room. Jason, Sarah's fiancé, pushed his way through the gathered family members. He walked purposefully toward the center of the conflict. Without hesitating, he positioned himself directly between Michael and Robert. He stood tall, acting as a physical shield to prevent any further attacks. His sudden intervention surprised everyone in the room. He picked up the microphone from the nearby karaoke machine and tapped it twice for attention. Jason reached over to the karaoke machine that had been set up for the party. He picked up the microphone and tapped the mesh head twice. The thumping sound amplified through the speakers, commanding immediate attention. He did not look at Sarah or the guests. His focus was entirely on Robert. It was clear he intended to take control of the situation. He pulled a sealed white envelope from his jacket pocket and held it up for everyone to see. Jason reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He withdrew a sealed white envelope that looked slightly crumpled. He held it up high so that everyone in the room could see it clearly. Robert's eyes narrowed as he focused on the object in Jason's hand. There was an authority in Jason's demeanor that made the family listen. Stepping between them, Jason announced to the stunned room that he helped Michael secure a DNA test to uncover the reason behind Robert's hatred. Jason took a deep breath and addressed the stunned room. He stated clearly that he had helped Michael secure a DNA test to uncover the true reason behind Robert's hatred. He explained that the constant abuse never made sense to him, so he went looking for answers. The guests exchanged confused glances as the weight of his words sank in. Robert lunged for the envelope in Jason's hand, but Michael stepped forward to block his path. Panic overtook Robert's features instantly. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the white envelope from Jason's grasp. Michael recovered quickly from his shock and stepped in front of his father. He used his body to block Robert's path, protecting Jason and the evidence. Robert clawed at Michael's arms, desperate to stop the revelation. The struggle was brief but desperate. Jason handed the envelope to Michael while the family members whispered amongst themselves in the background. Jason used the distraction to hand the envelope directly to Michael. The family members began whispering frantically amongst themselves. They speculated on what the test could possibly reveal. Michael took the envelope, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He looked at Jason, who nodded encouragingly. The secret was now in Michael's hands, and there was no going back. Michael tore open the top of the envelope and pulled out the folded papers inside slowly. Michael gripped the edge of the envelope tightly. The sound of tearing paper cut through the hushed whispers of the crowd. He reached inside and slowly pulled out the folded documents. Every eye in the room was fixed on his hands. Robert stopped fighting and stood frozen, watching his worst fear unfold. The tension was palpable as Michael prepared to read. Robert shouted at them to stop the reading immediately and walked toward the living room exit. "Stop!" Robert shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He demanded that Michael put the papers away immediately. When Michael ignored him, Robert turned sharply toward the door. He tried to storm out of the living room to escape the humiliation. He pushed past a chair, knocking it over in his haste. It was the reaction of a man who was cornered. Two of Michael's cousins stood in front of the doorway and blocked Robert from exiting the house. Robert's escape route was quickly cut off. Two of Michael's larger cousins stepped in front of the doorway. They crossed their arms and refused to move, effectively trapping Robert inside. They wanted to hear the truth just as much as everyone else. Robert looked around frantically, realizing he had nowhere to go. He was forced to turn back and face the consequences. Michael unfolded the document and began to read the text written on the page aloud clearly. Michael smoothed out the creases in the paper. He scanned the header to ensure he understood what he was looking at. With a steady voice, he began to read the text aloud for the room. He detailed the names on the report and the scientific findings listed below them. The room fell into a dead silence as the numbers were read. The results proved Michael was not the biological son of the man who had hit him, finally explaining his cruelty. The final sentence of the report hit the room like a bomb. The results proved unequivocally that Michael was not the biological son of the man who had just hit him. This revelation finally explained the years of cruelty and entitlement Robert had shown. Michael lowered the paper, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. He looked at his mother, who buried her face in her hands and began to weep. Michael turned his gaze toward his mother, who was sitting on the sofa. She didn't look up to meet his eyes. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and began to weep uncontrollably. Her reaction confirmed everything the paper had stated. She had kept this secret for decades, allowing Robert to mistreat her son. The sound of her sobbing filled the room. Robert stared at the floor in silence while the guests turned their gaze toward him judgmentally. Robert stood alone in the center of the room, stripped of his authority. He stared at the floor, unable to look anyone in the eye. The guests turned their gazes toward him, their expressions shifting from shock to judgment. The man who had demanded loyalty and property had built his life on a lie. His power over the family evaporated in an instant. Michael tossed the papers onto the table and walked out of the house without looking back. Michael didn't scream or demand an apology. He simply tossed the DNA results onto the coffee table in front of Robert. The papers slid across the surface, coming to a rest near the pen Robert had tried to force on him. Michael turned on his heel and walked straight toward the front door. He didn't look back at the sister who had watched him suffer. Jason followed Michael to his car and patted him on the shoulder before they drove away. The cool night air felt good as Michael reached his car. Jason jogged out behind him, closing the front door on the chaotic scene inside. He didn't say much, just reached out and patted Michael firmly on the shoulder. It was a gesture of solidarity and brotherhood. They both got into their vehicles and drove away, leaving the toxic house behind forever.